Welcome to SC-300 Practice Exam 5, Advanced Integration. You will work through 45 original Identity and Access Administration questions using the Identity Access dossier. Read each scenario and every requirement. After the answer choices, you will hear, "Lock in your answer." Then you get exactly 3 seconds of silence. Pause if you need more time. The review gives the complete correct answer, a concise, mechanism-focused explanation, and an exam clue. Question 1 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam updated the default Microsoft Entra sign-in branding in its production tenant from a blue acquisition banner to a green incident help banner. Test users whose browser language is English see the new green experience. Users whose browser-preferred language is French still see the obsolete blue experience. A French browser language branding customization was created during the acquisition, and all tests use the same tenant-specific sign-in URL. What should the identity architect do? Option A. Create a conditional access policy for the French users that requires the branded sign-in page. Option B. Edit the existing French browser language branding customization so it contains the new green banner and incident help text. Option C. Assign organizational branding administrator to the affected French users. Option D. Delete the default sign-in experience and recreate it with the green assets. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Edit the existing French browser language branding customization so it contains the new green banner and incident help text. Microsoft documents that a browser language sign-in customization overrides the default branding for browsers using that language. The split evidence, English displays the new default, while French displays the old acquisition design, and the known French customization isolate the failure to that language-specific object. Editing the French customization applies the new assets without altering access policy or granting end-user roles. Exam clue. When branding differs only by browser language, inspect the language-specific customization first. It overrides the default experience, so a correct default does not prove localized branding is current. Question 2 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam connects separate sales and marketing Salesforce instances to Microsoft Defender for cloud apps by using API app connectors. Sales activities stopped appearing yesterday, but marketing activities remain current. Cloud Discovery still reports traffic to both instances. On Cloud Apps, Connected Apps, the sales instance is disconnected and has a system alert for an invalid refresh token. The marketing instance is connected. What should the identity architect do? Option A. Reconnect only the Sales Salesforce API app connector and complete its provider authentication flow again. Option B. Mark Salesforce as unsanctioned in the Cloud App Catalog. Option C. Disconnect and reconnect the healthy marketing Salesforce connector so both instances rescan. Option D. Create a conditional access app control session policy for Salesforce. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Reconnect only the Salesforce API app connector and complete its provider authentication flow again. Defender for Cloud Apps manages supported API-connected instances independently. Microsoft states that connector failures or disconnections generate a system alert, and that reconnecting the affected connector restores connectivity. Because the sales instance alone is disconnected with an invalid refresh token, while marketing remains current and Cloud Discovery still sees traffic, the narrow remediation is to re-authenticate the sales API connector. Exam clue. Separate discovery evidence from API connector health. Continued traffic discovery does not prove API ingestion. A connector-specific disconnection or token alert calls for re-authentication of that instance. Question 3 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam has an active custom security attribute set named Merger Phase 1. Its region code attribute is assigned to users and enterprise applications and is consumed by an authorization workflow. After the merger, governance requires the attribute set identifier to be M and A. An attribute definition administrator attempts to rename Merger Phase 1, but the operation is unavailable. Fabricam must introduce the required identifier without interrupting current assignments during transition. What should the identity architect do? Option A, edit the name of Merger Phase 1 by using Microsoft Graph and keep its existing assignments. Option B, use Conditional Access to translate Merger Phase 1 to M and A when applications request the attribute. Option C, create the M and A attribute set and an equivalent attribute definition, migrate consumers and assignments in a controlled transition, and then deactivate the old definition when it is no longer used. Option D, delete Merger Phase 1 and immediately recreate it as M and A. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Create the M and DA attribute set and an equivalent attribute definition. Migrate consumers and assignments in a controlled transition, and then deactivate the old definition when it is no longer used. Microsoft documents that attribute set names cannot be renamed or deleted, and that custom security attribute definitions can be deactivated rather than deleted. Therefore, a required new identifier must be introduced as a new set and definition. Running both during a controlled migration preserves existing assignments and consumers until they are moved. The obsolete definition can then be deactivated. Exam clue. Treat custom security attribute identifiers as schema, not display labels. When an immutable name must change, create a replacement, migrate dependencies, and retire the old definition by deactivation. Question 4 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam uses PIM for Microsoft Entra roles and Azure resource roles. During an incident, an eligible administrator activated Contributor for the Prod Apps Azure subscription after approval and then changed a production resource. The response team must review all contributor activation records for that subscription and open the Azure resource activity associated with each activation. Microsoft Entra roles to resource audit does not show the event. Which investigation should the identity architect use? Option A, remain in PIM to Microsoft Entra roles to resource audit and filter for contributor. Option B, open the access review history for the contributor assignment and inspect the reviewer decisions. Option C, open PIM to Azure Resources, to Prod Apps, to My Audit, while signed in as the incident responder. Option D, open PIM to Azure Resources, select the Prod Apps subscription, open Resource Audit, filter for Activate, Assigned plus Activated, and open the activity details for the activation. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Open PIM over Azure Resources. Select the Prod Apps subscription, open Resource Audit, filter for Activate, Assigned plus Activated, and open the activity details for the activation. PIM separates Microsoft Entra directory roles from Azure RBAC resource roles. Contributor scoped to a subscription belongs under Azure Resources. Microsoft documents that the selected resource's resource audit shows all role activity, supports an Activate, Assigned plus Activated filter, and exposes activity details for the user's Azure actions. This supplies both the subscription-wide activation evidence and the requested activation to resource action correlation. Exam clue. Identify the PIM plane from the role scope before choosing a report. Directory roles use Microsoft Entra roles, while subscription, resource group, resource roles use Azure resources. Use Resource Audit for all principals, and My Audit only for yourself. Question 5 of 45. Select 2 answers. Fabricam copied an application-enforced restrictions policy from a test tenant into production. The policy targets Office 365, uses the Use App-Enforced Restrictions session control, includes all users, has no exclusions, and was set directly to On. SharePoint and Exchange Online already contain the intended unmanaged device restrictions. During an incident drill, both emergency access accounts show this production policy as applied, and the change record contains no report-only impact review. Fabricam must preserve emergency recovery access and validate user impact before enforcing the policy again. Which 2 actions should the identity architect take? Option A. Exclude the emergency access accounts from the policy. Option B. Replace the Office 365 target with all cloud apps, so every application can enforce the same restrictions. Option C. Add a require device to be marked as compliant grant control for all included users. Option D. Set the policy to report only, review its impact, and move it to On only after the results are confirmed. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A. Exclude the emergency access accounts from the policy, and D. Set the policy to report only, review its impact, and move it to On only after the results are confirmed. Microsoft's Application Enforced Restrictions Guidance recommends excluding emergency access accounts and deploying the policy in report-only mode before enabling enforcement. The Office 365 target and session control are already correct, so the remaining integration failures are emergency account scope and unsafe lifecycle promotion. Exam clue. When the target resource and session control are already correct, inspect rollout state and exclusions. Report only validates impact, and emergency accounts must remain outside policies that could restrict recovery access. Question 6 of 45. Select 1 answer. Fabricam enabled the Microsoft Traffic Profile and assigned it to the M365 pilot group. On a pilot device, the Global Secure Access Client is connected and Advanced Diagnostics shows Microsoft Entra, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Teams forwarding rules. Traffic logs contain those services, but Exchange Online traffic is absent. In the Microsoft Traffic Profile, the Exchange Online policy group is unchecked, while the other Microsoft 365 policy groups are enabled. What should the identity architect do? Option A. Publish Exchange Online through Microsoft Entra application proxy and assign the pilot group. Option B. Enable the Exchange Online policy group in the Microsoft Traffic Profile, then refresh the client forwarding profile and validate Exchange traffic. Option C. Deploy a private access connector near the Exchange Online service endpoints. Option D. Enable the General Internet Access profile for the pilot group so it acquires Exchange Online traffic. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Enable the Exchange Online policy group in the Microsoft Traffic Profile. Then refresh the client forwarding profile and validate Exchange traffic. The Microsoft Traffic Profile owns supported Microsoft 365 acquisition, and its service policy groups determine which Microsoft rules are enabled. The group assignment and client are already healthy, while the missing Exchange rules correlate directly with the unchecked Exchange Online policy group. Enabling that group is the narrow remediation. Exam clue. When some Microsoft 365 services forward and one does not, compare client forwarding rules with the Microsoft Traffic Profile's service policy groups before changing profiles or deploying private app infrastructure. Question 7 of 45. Select 2 answers. After integrating two business units, Fabricam standardizes emergency access in its production tenant. Two cloud-only store-on-Microsoft.com accounts have permanent active global administrator assignments, separate FIDO2 security keys, exclusions from blocking conditional access policies, alerts for all sign-in and audit activity, and successful 90-day validation drills. An architecture review finds that both accounts' keys are stored in the same Office safe, and that responders sign in from their normal administrator laptops. Fabricam must reduce correlated physical loss and isolate emergency administration from routinely used endpoints. Which two actions should the identity architect take? Option A. Store the emergency account credentials in secure, fireproof safes at separate locations accessible to authorized responders. Option B. Include both accounts in a conditional access policy that requires a compliant device. Option C. Require responders to use designated secure workstations or privileged access workstations for emergency account sessions. Option D. Convert both global administrator assignments from permanent active to PIM eligible with approval. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A. Store the emergency account credentials in secure, fireproof safes at separate locations accessible to authorized responders. And C. Require responders to use designated secure workstations or privileged access workstations for emergency account sessions. Microsoft's emergency access guidance calls for credentials in separate, secure, fireproof locations and use from designated secure workstations. Those controls close the two residual correlated risks without weakening the already correct permanent active assignments, phishing-resistant credentials, exclusions, monitoring, or validation cadence. Exam clue. Break glass resilience is not only identity configuration. Separate physical credential failure domains and isolate use to secure workstations while avoiding PIM or conditional access dependencies that can lock out recovery accounts. Question 8 of 45. Arrange all actions from first to last. Fabricam operates a multi-tenant deployment application in its production tenant. Microsoft Entra ID protection reports suspicious API traffic for the application service principal, and the investigation confirms unauthorized directory enumeration with a valid credential. The service principal is already disabled and marked compromised. Credentials exist on both the application object and the service principal object, and the workload can read deployment secrets from Azure Key Vault. Order the remediation actions Fabricam should complete before a separate validation and controlled re-enable. Items in the displayed order. Item A. Add a new governed X509 credential for the workload and stage the workload to use it. Item B. Rotate the deployment secrets in every Azure Key Vault that the compromised service principal could access. Item C. Inventory all credentials assigned to both the application object and the service principal object. Item D. Remove every existing credential from the application and service principal objects, so none of the pre-incident credentials remains valid. Lock in your answer. The correct order is Step 1. Inventory all credentials assigned to both the application object and the service principal object. Step 2. Add a new governed X.509 credential for the workload and stage the workload to use it. Step 3. Remove every existing credential from the application and service principal objects so none of the pre-incident credentials remains valid. Step 4. Rotate the deployment secrets in every Azure Key Vault that the compromised service principal could access. Microsoft Learn gives an explicit remediation sequence for a risky workload identity. Inventory credentials on the service principal and application objects, add a new credential with X.509 recommended, remove compromised credentials, and remove all existing credentials when the account is believed at risk, and rotate Azure Key Vault secrets the service principal could access. The identity is already contained and confirmed compromised, so the ordered task closes both reusable identity credentials and the residual downstream secret exposure without substituting a user risk action or a report-only disposition. Exam clue. For a compromised workload, trace reusable proof across dependency layers. Enumerate both identity objects. Establish the governed replacement. Invalidate every old credential, and then rotate secrets the identity could read. Question 9 of 45. Select 2 answers. Fabricam routes an enterprise SaaS application named DealHub through Conditional Access App Control. A Defender for Cloud App Session policy blocks cut, copy, print, and download for a scoped executive group. Tests on the base DealHub URL in supported browsers show the expected protection. However, a DealHub plugin opens documents on files.custom-dealhub.example. That hostname has no protected browser URL, and its activities are absent from the session log. The same executives can also use the DealHub native desktop client to download documents. The custom hostname is not associated with DealHub in the Cloud App Catalog. Fabricam must keep browser access while closing both bypasses. Which 2 configuration changes should the identity architect make? Option A. Remove the Conditional Access App Control session control and require multi-factor authentication for DealHub instead. Option B. Create a cloud discovery policy that alerts on traffic to files.custom-dealhub.example. Option C. Configure access control for the scoped executives to block DealHub native client access while allowing the browser path governed by Conditional Access App Control. Option D. Add files.2c-custom-dealhub.example as an associated custom domain for the DealHub app in the Cloud App Catalog. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are D. Add files.custom-dealhub.example as an associated custom domain for the DealHub app in the Cloud App Catalog, and C. Configure access control for the scoped executives to block DealHub native client access while allowing the browser path governed by Conditional Access App Control. Defender for Cloud Apps identifies applications using Cloud App Catalog data. Microsoft states that associated custom domains must be added when an app is customized with plugins. That repairs recognition of the plugin browser hostname. Session controls apply only to interactive browser sessions, so leaving the native desktop client available preserves a download bypass. Microsoft recommends blocking native client access and allowing only the controlled browser path when bypass prevention is required. The existing routing and session policy already work on the base domain, so replacing them or adding a discovery alert does not resolve the 2 observed gaps. Exam clue. When Conditional Access App Control works on the base browser URL, but misses a plugin and a desktop path, separate app identification from client support. Map every custom domain and close unsupported native client bypasses with access control. Question 10 of 45. Match each observation to one catalog action. Each action is used once. Fabricam is reconciling cloud discovery findings with its organization-specific risk model in Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. Match each observation to the smallest Cloud App Catalog action that addresses it. Requirements. Requirement 1. An existing catalog entry says SOC 2 is unavailable, but the vendor has supplied current public evidence of SOC 2 compliance. Fabricam wants the underlying catalog data reviewed rather than a local score override. Requirement 2. Cloud Discovery traffic shows a new SaaS product by name and domain, but the product is absent from the Cloud App Catalog and has no catalog score. Fabricam wants Microsoft's cloud analysis team to evaluate it. Requirement 3. Across the organization, lack of multi-factor authentication support must contribute much more heavily to calculated app risk. Fabricam does not want to override individual app scores. Target bank, choice A. In Cloud Discovery Score metrics, set the multi-factor authentication risk factor, importance, to very high. Choice B. From discovered apps, choose Suggest New App and submit the product name and domain. Choice C. Open the existing app and request a score update, selecting the option to update app data. Lock in your answer. The correct mapping is Requirement 1 maps to C. Open the existing app and request a score update, selecting the option to update app data. Requirement 2 maps to B. From discovered apps, choose Suggest New App and submit the product name and domain. Requirement 3 maps to A. In Cloud Discovery Score metrics, set the multi-factor authentication risk factor, importance, to very high. The Cloud App Catalog exposes separate controls for separate evidence states. An uncatalogued app is submitted through Suggest New App with its name and domain. Stale data on an existing entry is sent to the analysis team through Request Score Update and Update App Data. Organization-wide weighting is configured under Cloud Discovery Score metrics by changing a factor's importance. These are lifecycle and model governance actions, not the unsanctioned tagging and immediate single app score override used for a different decision boundary. Exam clue. Choose the catalog control from the evidence state. Absent app means suggest a new app. Stale Microsoft data means request an update. Organization-wide scoring priorities mean change score metric weighting. Question 11 of 45. Select one answer. During a merger, Fabricam uses PIM for groups to govern the owners of the cloud security group merger control. Alex has an eligible owner assignment and activates it for 1 hour. While Alex is active, the only other active owner leaves the company and is deleted. After Alex's activation expires, the PIM audit shows repeated deactivation attempts, but Alex remains an active owner. The group has no other active owners. What should the identity architect do? Option A. Add another trusted principal as an active owner of merger control, and then allow PIM to complete Alex's ownership deactivation. Option B. Delete merger control and recreate it with a new permanent owner before adding it back to PIM. Option C. Convert Alex's eligible owner assignment to an eligible member assignment while the deactivation is pending. Option D. Create an access review for the group's owners and configure denied users to be removed automatically. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Add another trusted principal as an active owner of merger control, and then allow PIM to complete Alex's ownership deactivation. PIM normally removes temporary group ownership when activation expires. Microsoft documents an exception. Microsoft Entra ID will not remove the last active owner of a group. PIM retries the deactivation for up to 30 days. Because deletion of the other owner left Alex as the sole active owner, adding another trusted active owner restores owner continuity and allows PIM to remove Alex's expired temporary ownership. Exam clue. When expired PIM group ownership remains active, inspect owner continuity before changing the assignment. A last active owner safeguard can block deactivation, even when the activation timer and PIM workflow are functioning. Question 12 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam routes public internet traffic from 3 merger branch offices through connected global secure access remote networks. Traffic logs show the branch destinations in the internet channel, so acquisition is working. A web content filtering policy blocks unsanctioned file sharing sites for client users, but branch kiosks can still reach them. The policy is linked only to a custom security profile selected by a user-scoped conditional access policy. Fabricam must enforce the filtering policy on all traffic from every connected branch, including traffic without user identity. What should the identity architect do? Option A. Assign the Internet Access Traffic Forwarding profile to a group containing the kiosk users. Option B. Publish each unsanctioned site through Microsoft Entra application proxy and require assignment. Option C. Link the web content filtering policy to the Global Secure Access baseline security profile. Option D. Install the Global Secure Access client on every kiosk and remove the branch remote network connections. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Link the web content filtering policy to the Global Secure Access baseline security profile. The logs prove that internet traffic acquisition from the remote networks already works. Microsoft documents that the baseline security profile automatically applies linked security policies to all traffic routed through Global Secure Access, including remote network traffic, without requiring conditional access. Linking the existing filtering policy to the baseline profile therefore covers branch traffic even when no user identity is available. Exam clue: separate acquisition from enforcement. If remote network traffic already appears in the correct Global Secure Access channel, repair the security profile scope. Use the baseline profile when enforcement must include all routed branch traffic without relying on user identity. Question 13 of 45. Match each incident trace to one configuration record. Use no record more than once. One record is not used. Fabricam is validating 4 privileged access configuration records after a merger. Each incident trace was produced by one record, and each trace confirms 2 control boundaries while exposing 1 defect. Match each trace to the record that explains all 3 observations. Requirements. Requirement 1. Elevation requires the tenant's strongest approved method, and an unmanaged device session cannot use the role. However, the specialist receives role privileges immediately at the engagement start without requesting elevation, although the assignment still expires at the engagement end date. Requirement 2. The specialist remains without privilege until elevation, cannot elevate after the engagement end date, and is blocked when using an active role from an unmanaged device. However, elevation completes from an ordinary existing browser session without the tenant's strongest approved method. Requirement 3. Elevation requires the tenant's strongest approved method, and the specialist remains without privilege until elevation, and cannot elevate after the engagement end date. However, after managed device elevation, a separate unmanaged device session can use the active role. Target bank. Choice A. Do not require an authentication context in the role settings. Separately, target the directory role with a compliant device policy. Give the specialist a dated eligible assignment. Choice B. Require an authentication context in the role settings. In its conditional access policy, require phishing-resistant strength with every time sign-in frequency. Separately, target the directory role with a compliant device policy. Give the specialist a dated eligible assignment. Choice C. Require an authentication context in the role settings. In its conditional access policy, require phishing-resistant strength with every time sign-in frequency. Do not apply a separate conditional access policy to the directory role. Give the specialist a dated eligible assignment. Choice D. Require an authentication context in the role settings. In its conditional access policy, require phishing-resistant strength with every time sign-in frequency. Separately, target the directory role with a compliant device policy. Give the specialist a dated active assignment. Lock in your answer. The correct mapping is Requirement 1 maps to D. Require an authentication context in the role settings. In its conditional access policy, require phishing-resistant strength with every time sign-in frequency. Separately, target the directory role with a compliant device policy. Give the specialist a dated active assignment. Requirement 2 maps to A. Do not require an authentication context in the role settings. Separately, target the directory role with a compliant device policy. Give the specialist a dated eligible assignment. Requirement 3 maps to C. Require an authentication context in the role settings. In its conditional access policy, require phishing-resistant strength with every time sign-in frequency. Do not apply a separate conditional access policy to the directory role. Give the specialist a dated eligible assignment. Each trace reports 2 controls working and 1 failing. D uniquely explains missing activation time strong proof, while preserving later use and assignment behavior. B uniquely explains unmanaged use after activation, while preserving activation proof and eligibility. C uniquely explains standing privilege during a dated engagement, while preserving the 2 conditional access boundaries. A is a fully compliant baseline and explains none of the failures. Exam clue. Treat each configuration as a 3-plane record, not as a label. Verify what it does at the elevation event, at a later sign-in that uses the active role, and across the principal's assignment interval. 2 passing observations are as decisive as the 1 failure. Question 14 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam is separating a business unit, but will collaborate with Contoso for the next year. The catalog is enabled for external users and already contains one access package with the required app, group, and SharePoint roles. Contoso is a configured, connected organization with 2 recorded external sponsors. Contoso users who are not yet guests must be able to self-request the package. A Contoso sponsor must approve each request. Each assignment must expire after 45 days. When a user later loses the last assignment to any access package, Fabricam must block sign-in and then remove the governed guest account under the tenant's configured external user lifecycle. Which entitlement plan meets the requirements with the narrowest request scope? Option A. Create one external request policy for the package. Limit requesters to the Contoso connected organization. Use a selected Fabricam internal sponsor as approver. Expire assignments after 45 days. And keep tenant cleanup triggered only after the final access package assignment ends. Option B. Create one external request policy for the package. Limit requesters to the Contoso connected organization. Use an external sponsor as approver. Expire assignments after 45 days. And start guest cleanup whenever this package assignment ends. Option C. Create one external request policy for the package. Allow users from all configured connected organizations. Use each organization's external sponsor as approver. Expire assignments after 45 days. And keep tenant cleanup triggered only after the final access package assignment ends. Option D. Create one external request policy for the package. Limit requesters to the Contoso connected organization. Use an external sponsor as approver. Expire assignments after 45 days. And keep tenant cleanup triggered only after the final access package assignment ends. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Create one external request policy for the package. Limit requesters to the Contoso connected organization. Use an external sponsor as approver. Expire assignments after 45 days. And keep tenant cleanup triggered only after the final access package assignment ends. Limiting the external policy to the existing Contoso connected organization admits not yet guest Contoso users without exposing the package to other partners. An external sponsor provides the required partner-side approval. The policy bounds each assignment to 45 days, and tenant lifecycle settings act only after the user loses the last access package assignment. Exam clue. Evaluate complete entitlement plans one access at a time. Requester scope can still be too broad. An approver can belong to the wrong relationship. And guest cleanup must wait for loss of the final governed access package assignment. Question 15 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam uses a conditional access policy to block Exchange Online and SharePoint Online when users leave an approved location. The targeted users and clients support Continuous Access Evaluation, CAE. During merger testing, a user moves from an approved office to an unapproved network, but the active sessions continue until the 1-hour access token expires. Sign-in logs show no policy exclusion. The named location in the policy is defined by countries' regions, while the office and resource provider egress addresses are stable and enumerable. Fabricam requires location changes to be enforced in near real time. What should the identity architect do? Option A. Keep the policy unchanged and have administrators revoke each user's sessions whenever the user changes networks. Option B. Replace the country's region's named location with an IP-based named location that includes every IPv4 and IPv6 egress address visible to Microsoft Entra and the resource providers. Option C. Keep the country's region's named location and add a 1-hour sign-in frequency session control. Option D. Add the approved country to the MFA Trusted IPs configuration and keep the country's region's condition. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Replace the countries/regions named location with an IP-based name location that includes every IPv4 and IPv6 egress address visible to Microsoft Entra and the resource providers. CAE can enforce network location changes in near real time, only for IP-based conditional access name locations. Microsoft documents that CAE does not have insight into country/region locations or MFA trusted IPs. In those cases, Microsoft Entra issues a 1-hour token without instant IP enforcement. Because the egress addresses are stable and enumerable, replacing the location with IP ranges and including all IPv4 and IPv6 addresses seen by both Microsoft Entra and the resource providers supplies the required signal. Exam clue. When CAE appears healthy, but a location change waits for token expiry, inspect how the named location is defined. Real-time location enforcement depends on IP-based ranges and complete identity provider/resource provider egress coverage. Question 16 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam has a multi-tenant merger administration application with a web client and a protected web API. Authentication context C8 is published, and a conditional access policy targeting C8 requires phishing-resistant authentication. The web client requests C8 before its delete acquisition action, and interactive tests step up correctly. A penetration test calls the API operation directly, with a valid access token that has no C8 value in its ACRS claim. The API still performs the deletion. Which change should the identity architect require? Option A. Treat the web client's request for C8 as proof of authorization and allow the API to accept any otherwise valid access token. Option B. Replace the authentication context policy with a conditional access policy that targets the entire web API for every operation. Option C. Map the API operation to the tenant's C8 context. Verify C8 in the token's ACRS claim, and return an insufficient claims challenge when it is absent, so the client can request a compliant token. Option D. Add ACRS as an optional claim only to the web client's ID token, and leave the API operation unchanged. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Map the API operation to the tenant's C8 context, verify C8 in the token's ACRS claim, and return an insufficient claims challenge when it is absent, so the client can request a compliant token. Authentication context requires enforcement by the resource that owns the sensitive operation. Microsoft instructs the Web API to map operations to authentication context IDs, inspect the access token's ACUROS claim, and, when the required value is absent, return a 401 claims challenge with error insufficient claims. A capable client then sends the claims request to Microsoft Entra for conditional access evaluation, and retries with a token containing the required context. Relying only on the client's UI flow leaves a direct API path unprotected. Exam clue. Authentication context is not merely a client-side prompt. Protect the resource operation. Map action to context, inspect AKRs, deny a missing value, and propagate the claims challenge through the client. Question 17 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam uses PHS with seamless SSO for users in an acquired Windows Server AD forest. Seamless SSO works on existing corporate devices, but users on Microsoft Edge devices in the acquired OU receive password prompts during standard, not in private or guest, sessions. On an affected device, resultant set of policy maps https://autologon.microsoftazureed-sso.com to the intranet zone. The Edge policy page shows that auth server allow list is managed by the acquired OU browser baseline. A network trace to the Autologon endpoint receives a 401 negotiate challenge. But Edge's retry contains no authorization header. Which policy change should the identity architect make? Option A. Add https://autologon.microsoftazureed-sso.com to auth server allow list in the acquired OU browser baseline. Option B. Move https://autologon.microsoftazureed-sso.com from the intranet zone to the trusted sites zone in the acquired OU policy. Option C. Add https://autologon.microsoftazureed-sso.com only to auth negotiate delegate allow list in the acquired OU browser baseline. Option D. Remove the intranet zone mapping and add https://autologon.microsoftazureed-sso.com to auth negotiate delegate allow list. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Add https://autologon.microsoftazureed-sso.com to auth server allow list in the acquired OU browser baseline. Microsoft documents two relevant browser requirements. The Microsoft Entra Autologon URL must be in the intranet zone. And when Edge's auth server allow list is overridden, the same URL must also be included there. The affected devices already receive the intranet zone mapping, but Edge does not answer the endpoint's negotiate challenge, while auth server allow list is managed by their OU baseline. Adding the endpoint to that effective allow list repairs the browser policy boundary without replacing a required zone setting or substituting a delegation policy. Exam clue. A 401 negotiate challenge, followed by no authorization header, points to the browser withholding integrated credentials. When Edge authentication allow lists are policy managed, keep the required intranet zone mapping and include the Microsoft Entra Autologon URL in auth server allow list. Question 18 of 45. Select one answer. During a merger, a privileged support engineer loses the phone that held the engineer's only device-bound passkey. The account has no other usable multi-factor authentication method. An authentication administrator issues a one-time temporary access pass, TAP. The engineer uses the tap for a test sign-in, signs out without registering a replacement method, and later receives temporary access pass sign-in was blocked due to user credential policy at security info. The engineer is in scope for the tap policy, and the pass is still within its configured time window. What should the administrator do? Option A. Reset the engineer's password and require phishing-resistant authentication strength at the next sign-in. Option B. Change the tenant tap policy to allow multi-use passes so the already used one-time tap becomes valid again. Option C. Delete the lost passkey from the account and wait for the original tap to become usable again before its time window closes. Option D. Create a new tap for the engineer, overriding the used tap, and have the engineer use the new pass to open security info and register a replacement passkey. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Create a new tap for the engineer, overriding the used tap, and have the engineer use the new pass to open security info and register a replacement passkey. Microsoft documents tap as a bootstrap for registering passwordless methods. Its troubleshooting guidance explicitly identifies an already used one-time tap as a cause of the user credential policy block. A user can have only one tap, and creating a new tap overrides the existing one. The new pass restores a supervised authentication path, so the engineer can register the replacement passkey. Cleanup of the lost method can then follow. Exam clue. For tap failures, separate validity time from use state. A one-time pass can still be inside its time window, yet be unusable because it was consumed. Recovery requires a new bootstrap credential, not a stronger authorization rule. Question 19 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam assigns Microsoft Entra IDP2 to a cloud security group named Identity Platform Licensed. 2 pilot users who are direct members receive the license. After regional security groups are added as members of Identity Platform Licensed, 240 users who belong only to those regional groups remain unlicensed. The parent group's license assignment reports no product capacity error, and each affected user has a valid usage location. Membership evidence shows that none of the affected users is a first-level member of Identity Platform Licensed. What should the identity architect do? Option A. Repeatedly select Reprocess for Identity Platform Licensed until Microsoft Entra expands the nested regional memberships. Option B. Change the membership design so the affected users are first-level members of Identity Platform Licensed, for example, by using a direct or attribute-based dynamic membership rule. Option C. Create a conditional access policy for the regional groups that requires Microsoft Entra IDP2 features. Option D. Clear usage location on the affected users so they inherit the tenant location and leave the nested group design unchanged. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Change the membership design so the affected users are first-level members of Identity Platform Licensed, for example, by using a direct or attribute-based dynamic membership rule. Microsoft documents that group-based licensing does not support nested groups. When licenses are assigned to a group, only users in the first level are assigned licenses. The successful pilot users and absent capacity or location errors isolate membership depth as the failure boundary. Making the users direct first-level members, manually or through an appropriate dynamic group design, places them on the supported assignment path. Exam clue. When group licensing works for direct members but fails uniformly for users represented only by child groups, inspect membership depth before retrying processing or changing unrelated access controls. Question 20 of 45. Match each observed record to one configuration. Use no configuration more than once. One configuration is not used. Contoso has healthy cross-tenant synchronization into Fabricam. Source and target permissions, assignment scope, and the connection test are valid. An identity integration engineer compares 4 independent observed records with 5 attribute mapping configurations. Match each observation to the one configuration that explains every signal. Requirements. Requirement 1. The mapping saves and the cycle completes. A new B2B collaboration object is created with /customer.guest. Requirement 2. The mapping saves and the cycle completes. No replacement object is created. Inspection still shows .clad equals guest on the pre-existing target object. Requirement 3. The mapping cannot be saved. No provisioning cycle starts, and the editor reports schema invalid. Requirement 4. The mapping saves and the cycle completes. A new B2B collaboration object is created with .land equals member. Target bank, choice A. The matching designation is moved from alternative security identifier to another attribute. No target object exists. The Youngchung mapping uses the product default, and apply this mapping is not set to always. Choice B. The reserved matching attribute is unchanged. No target object exists. The uniqueness mapping uses the supported non-default constant, and apply this mapping is not set to always. Choice C. The reserved matching attribute is unchanged. No target object exists. The value mapping uses the product default, and apply this mapping is not set to always. Choice D. The reserved matching attribute is unchanged. A target object already exists with the non-default type. The Youngchung mapping uses the product default, and apply this mapping is not set to always. Choice E. The reserved matching attribute is unchanged. A target object already exists with the non-default type. The Youngchung mapping and apply this mapping is set to always. Lock in your answer. The correct mapping is requirement 1 maps to B. The reserved matching attribute is unchanged. No target object exists. The Nesima mapping uses the supported non-default constant, and apply this mapping is not set to always. Requirement 2 maps to D. The reserved matching attribute is unchanged. A target object already exists with the non-default type. The WellSocket mapping uses the product default, and apply this mapping is not set to always. Requirement 3 maps to A. The matching designation is moved from alternative security identifier to another attribute. No target object exists. The UN object and apply this mapping is not set to always. Requirement 4 maps to C. The reserved matching attribute is unchanged. No target object exists. The UN product default and apply this mapping is not set to always. The matching designation cannot be moved away from alternative security identifier. Doing so produces schema invalid. For a new target object, the default UN object creates an external member, and the supported non-default value creates an external guest. For a pre-existing non-default B2B object, the default mapping changes the type only when apply this mapping is always. Exam clue. Use all observed signals. First, decide whether the mapping can be saved. Then, separate creation from update behavior and default from non-default wget handling. Question 21 of 45. Select 2 answers. Under the Contoso Global Merger Integration case, Fabricam engineers use unmanaged devices to access one assigned on-premises application published through Microsoft Entra application proxy. Contoso currently has a conditional access policy that targets the engineers and all resources and requires a compliant device. Contoso must allow browser access to only this published application from those unmanaged devices, continue requiring multi-factor authentication for the application, and retain the compliant device requirement for every other resource. Which 2 policy changes should the lead identity architect make? Option A. Exclude the Fabricam engineers from both the compliant device policy and the all resources multi-factor authentication policy. Option B. Keep or create a separate conditional access policy that targets the engineers and all resources, has no resource exclusions, and requires multi-factor authentication. Option C. Create a policy for the published application that grants access without requiring a compliant device, but leave the application included in the existing compliant device policy. Option D. Exclude the published enterprise application from the target resources of the existing compliant device policy. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are D. Exclude the published enterprise application from the target resources of the existing compliant device policy, and B. Keep or create a separate conditional access policy that targets the engineers and all resources, has no resource exclusions, and requires multi-factor authentication. Conditional access evaluates every applicable policy. An easier policy does not override a stricter one. The published application proxy enterprise application must therefore be removed from the target resources of the compliant device policy. A separate all resources MFA policy without resource exclusions still applies to the app and preserves MFA, while the compliant device policy continues to protect all other resources. Emergency access accounts would remain excluded according to Contoso policy, but the engineer population is not excluded. Exam clue. When multiple conditional access policies apply, satisfy the exception by changing the assignment of the policy that imposes the unwanted control. Preserve independent baseline controls in a separate, broadly scoped policy. Do not expect a permissive policy to negate a stricter one. Question 22 of 45. Match each finding to one architecture change. Each architecture change is used once. Under the Contoso Global Merger Integration case, 3 application proxy production readiness findings require different design changes. Match each finding to the smallest architecture change that directly addresses it. Requirements. Requirement 1. A Fabricam application is reachable only from its isolated network segment. The current default connector group contains only Contoso network connectors, which cannot resolve or reach the backend. Requirement 2. A production connector group can reach its backend, but contains only one healthy connector. Maintenance of that connector must not interrupt published access. Requirement 3. A published application uses multiple backend servers and requires a user session to remain on one backend. Requests can arrive through different connectors, so connector or source IP affinity is not reliable. Target bank. Choice A. Place a layer 7 load balancer in front of the backend farm and use a load balancer session cookie for persistence. Choice B. Deploy a dedicated connector group with connectors in the isolated application network and assign the enterprise application to that group. Choice C. Add at least a second connector to the assigned production group, preferably using a different outbound connection. Lock in your answer. The correct mapping is Requirement 1 maps to B. Deploy a dedicated connector group with connectors in the isolated application network and assign the enterprise application to that group. Requirement 2 maps to C. Add at least a second connector to the assigned production group, preferably using a different outbound connection. Requirement 3 maps to A. Place a layer 7 load balancer in front of the backend farm, and use a load balancer session cookie for persistence. Application proxy design separates enterprise application configuration from the private connector path and from backend load balancing. Connector groups bind applications to network reachable connectors. Multiple connectors in the assigned group provide service continuity, and persistence for a server farm must be implemented behind the connectors with an application-aware layer 7 mechanism, rather than assumed from the cloud service. Exam clue. Trace application proxy end to end. First, bind the app to connectors that can reach its segment. Then, remove connectors' single points of failure. Then, satisfy backend farm affinity behind the connectors. Question 23 of 45. Arrange all actions from first to last. Under the Contoso Global Merger Integration case, no entitlement management catalog exists for a new Fabricam integration program. Contoso must create one access package that grants the member role of the merger workspace group and access to the integration portal enterprise application. A policy must allow users from the Fabricam connected organization to request the package, require sponsor approval, and expire assignments after 90 days. Arrange the actions in the required dependency order. Items in the displayed order. Item A. Add Merger Workspace and Integration Portal as resources in the Merger Integration Catalog. Item B. Start creating the access package in Merger Integration. Add the group member role and the application access role and advance to requests. Item C. Add the initial policy for the Fabricam connected organization. Configure sponsor approval and 90-day assignment expiration. Item D. Create an enabled catalog named Merger Integration. Lock in your answer. The correct order is Step 1. Create an enabled catalog named Merger Integration. Step 2. Add Merger Workspace and Integration Portal as resources in the Merger Integration Catalog. Step 3. Start creating the access package in Merger Integration. Add the group member role and the application access role and advance to requests. Step 4. Add the initial policy for the Fabricam connected organization. Configure sponsor approval and 90-day assignment expiration. A catalog is the container and resource boundary for an access package. After the catalog exists, its resources can be onboarded. Package creation can then begin in that catalog and select roles from those resources. The initial policy identifies the Fabricam requester population and applies sponsor approval and lifecycle expiration before the package is finalized. Reversing a dependency attempts to select a non-existent catalog, resource, or package context. Exam clue. For greenfield entitlement delivery, order by ownership dependencies. Catalog, catalog resources, package resource roles, then the policy governing requesters, approval, and lifecycle. Question 24 of 45. Select two answers. Contoso has a Defender for Cloud Apps session policy that blocks downloads of files labeled highly confidential from SharePoint Online on unmanaged devices. The application is onboarded, but the policy report shows no matched sessions. Browser tests never show an mcas.ms URL, and users can still download the files through a native sync client. Contoso must preserve browser viewing while preventing both observed bypass paths. Which two actions should the lead identity architect take? Option A. Create a Defender for Cloud Apps access policy that blocks native client access for the targeted unmanaged device population. Option B. Create or update the Microsoft Entra Conditional Access policy for SharePoint Online so its session control uses Conditional Access app control. Validate it in report only and then enable it. Option C. Create a second session policy with the same file label, device condition, and block download action. Option D. Create a Cloud Discovery anomaly detection policy for SharePoint downloads. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A. Create a Defender for Cloud Apps access policy that blocks native client access for the targeted unmanaged device population. And B. Create or update the Microsoft Entra Conditional Access policy for SharePoint Online so its session control uses Conditional Access app control. Validate it in report only and then enable it. Defender session enforcement requires two connected layers. Microsoft Entra Conditional Access must route supported browser sessions by using the Conditional Access app control session control. Only then can the existing Defender session policy inspect and block sensitive downloads. Native clients do not traverse that browser reverse proxy session, so an access policy must block that client path to prevent bypass while browser viewing remains available. Exam clue. When a Defender session policy has 0 matches, verify the route before editing the content rule. Then inventory non-browser paths separately. Session policies govern proxy browser activity, while access policy can close unsupported native client bypass. Question 25 of 45. Match each failure to one remediation. Each remediation is used once. Contoso restores 3 Azure workloads after a merger recovery exercise. Each workload must continue using managed identity without stored credentials. Match each observed failure to the smallest remediation that directly addresses it. Requirements. Requirement 1. A replacement VM must reuse an existing user-assigned managed identity, whose target role assignments are still valid. Token acquisition reports that the requested identity is not assigned to the VM. Requirement 2. A VM obtains a token for its attached user-assigned managed identity, but the downstream storage service returns an authorization failure. The identity has no role assignment on the storage account. Requirement 3. An app service app was deleted and recreated with the same name. Its former system-assigned service principal was deleted, and the target role assignment still references that former principal. Target bank. Choice A. Grant the current user-assigned managed identity the required Azure role on the storage account. Choice B. Enable a system-assigned managed identity on the recreated app and create the required target role assignment for the new service principal. Choice C. Assign the existing user-assigned managed identity to the replacement VM and keep its existing target authorization. Lock in your answer. The correct mapping is Requirement 1 maps to C. Assign the existing user-assigned managed identity to the replacement VM and keep its existing target authorization. Requirement 2 maps to A. Grant the current user-assigned managed identity the required Azure role on the storage account. Requirement 3 maps to B. Enable a system-assigned managed identity on the recreated app and create the required target role assignment for the new service principal. Managed identity recovery has 2 separate control planes. Assign or enable the identity on the source workload, then authorize that identity on the target service. A user-assigned identity survives independently and can be attached to a replacement resource. A system-assigned identity is deleted with its parent, so recreating the parent creates a different service principal that needs fresh authorization. When token acquisition already succeeds, but the target denies access, the remaining gap is target authorization rather than identity creation or attachment. Exam clue. Diagnose managed identity failures in order. Confirm the intended identity still exists. Confirm it is enabled or assigned on the source. Then confirm that exact principal is authorized on the target. Resource recreation matters only for lifecycle coupled system identities. Question 26 of 45. Select one answer. Contoso uses a dynamic security group, whose rule includes users when department equals merger operations. An administrator changes a user's department to merger operations, but the user is not added. The rule validates successfully, and the group overview shows dynamic rule processing status. Update paused. What should the administrator do? Option A. Add the user manually as a direct member of the dynamic group. Option B. Create a conditional access policy that targets the user and the group. Option C. Resume processing for the dynamic group so membership rule processing state is no longer paused. Option D. Change the group membership type from dynamic user to assigned. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Resume processing for the dynamic group, so membership rule processing state is no longer paused. Microsoft documents that update paused means an administrator paused dynamic membership processing, and membership rule processing state is set to paused. A group's administrator or another appropriately privileged administrator can resume processing. Because the rule validates and the user attribute already matches, no rule rewrite, manual membership, or access policy is needed. Exam clue. When a dynamic group stops reflecting valid attribute changes, read its processing status before editing the rule. Update paused is an administrative state, so resume evaluation rather than replacing the membership model. Question 27 of 45. Select one answer. Contoso sets maximum number of devices per user in Microsoft Entra ID to 5 and the Intune device limit to 10. A user already owns 5 Microsoft Entra registered BYOD devices and cannot register a replacement phone. One listed phone was retired months ago, but its device object still exists in Microsoft Entra ID. Contoso must keep the Microsoft Entra limit at 5. What should the administrator do? Option A. If the stale phone is still managed, retire or wipe it in Intune, and then delete its device object from Microsoft Entra ID. Option B. Disable the stale phone's device object in Microsoft Entra ID, but leave the object in the directory. Option C. Increase the Intune device limit from 10 to 15. Option D. Configure the replacement phone as Microsoft Entra Hybrid Joined, so the user device limit does not apply. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. If the stale phone is still managed, retire or wipe it in Intune, and then delete its device object from Microsoft Entra ID. The Microsoft Entra maximum number of devices per user setting limits how many devices a user can join or register. Here, it is the binding limit, because it is 5 while Intune allows 10. Microsoft Entra supports deleting obsolete device identities and advises retiring or wiping devices in their management authority before deletion. Removing the stale registered phone frees one of the user's 5 device slots without changing the tenant limit. Exam clue. When registration hits a device ceiling, identify which limit is actually lower and whether the enrollment method is subject to it. For obsolete managed devices, clean up the management authority first, then remove the stale directory identity. Question 28 of 45. Arrange all actions from first to last. After a merger, Contoso must create a quarterly access review for the privileged role administrator role. The review must include all active and eligible assignments held by direct users or role assignable groups. Each user's manager should review the assignment. A governance panel must review users without a manager and every role assignable group. Denied assignments must be removed automatically after each review completes, while a missing response must leave access unchanged. Order the configuration actions. Items in the displayed order. Item A. Bind the review population to direct users and role assignable groups holding active or eligible privileged role administrator assignments. Item B. Bind the definition to the required quarterly recurrence, duration, start date, and series end. Item C. Resolve reviewer coverage with manager as the primary reviewer, and the governance panel for principals that have no usable manager path. Item D. Establish a Microsoft Entra role review definition in the PIM Access Review control plane. Item E. Persist no change for missing responses and automatic application of denied results as the review's completion behavior. Lock in your answer. The correct order is Step 1. Establish a Microsoft Entra role review definition in the PIM Access Review control plane. Step 2. Bind the definition to the required quarterly recurrence, duration, start date, and series end. Step 3. bind the review population to direct users and role assignable groups holding active or eligible privileged role administrator assignments. Step 4. Resolve reviewer coverage with manager as the primary reviewer and the governance panel for principals that have no usable manager path. Step 5. Persist no change for missing responses and automatic application of denied results as the review's completion behavior. The review definition must exist in the PIM Microsoft Entra role plane before recurrence is attached. The recurring definition is then bound to the exact role assignment population. Reviewer coverage is resolved for that population, including fallback processing for managerless users and role assignable groups. Completion behavior finally governs non-responses and automatic denied result application. The wording does not expose first or last position through new create labels. Exam clue. Infer dependencies from the object being configured. A recurring role review definition owns a population. That population determines reviewer coverage, and only the completed definition can own result application behavior. Question 29 of 45. Arrange all 4 MyAccess self-review actions in dependency order. Contoso uses Microsoft Entra self-review for legacy finance. Mina's recorded decision is yes. The review status is active. Automatic result application is configured. And business evidence says Mina does not need the assignment. The support record gives 4 product facts in shuffled dependency order. Assignment enforcement belongs to configured result application. A submitted reviewer decision is editable in an active review. MyAccess distinguishes the applicable review through its application and deadline attributes, and a persisted attestation reflects the selected access needed value. Arrange the actions Mina uses to record no herself. Items in the displayed order. Item A. Set does this user need continued access to no, using the resource owner's evidence. Item B. In MyAccess Access Reviews, select Mina's legacy finance entry by resource and due date. Item C. Commit the response pane with no selected. Item D. For that active review, invoke change response and confirm the stored attestation is yes. Lock in your answer. The correct order is Step 1. In MyAccess Access Reviews, select Mina's legacy finance entry by resource and due date. Step 2. For that active review, invoke change response and confirm the stored attestation is yes. Step 3. Set does this user need continued access to no, using the resource owner's evidence. Step 4. Commit the response pane with no selected. The matching legacy finance entry supplies the self-review context. In an active review, change response exposes Mina's submitted yes for editing. Owner evidence supports selecting no, and committing the pane records that attestation. No is a reviewer decision rather than an immediate access removal control. Configured result application owns enforcement at review completion. Exam clue. Use MyAccess control availability and access review decision semantics. Identify the record context. Determine which control unlocks a submitted attestation. Set the supported value and commit it. Question 30 of 45. Arrange all actions from first to last. Microsoft Entra ID protection raises high user risk for a cloud-only merger administrator. Sign-in logs and Defender XDR show an unfamiliar device, a new ASN, successful token use, and unauthorized privileged changes. The administrator does not recognize the activity when reached by a trusted phone number. Self-remediation is not considered safe. The affected applications use Microsoft Entra tokens and do not maintain independent application-issued session cookies. Arrange the response actions into the operational runbook sequence, items in the displayed order. Item A. Replace the password and authentication method state, validate account control, and restore permitted sign-in. Item B. Record the evidence-backed confirmed compromise disposition in Microsoft Entra ID protection. Item C. Disable new authentication for the account and revoke Microsoft Entra sessions and refresh tokens. Item D. Correlate risk detections, sign-in properties, Defender XDR activity, affected resources, and trusted channel user testimony. Lock in your answer. The correct order is Step 1. Disable new authentication for the account and revoke Microsoft Entra sessions and refresh tokens. Step 2. Correlate risk detections, sign-in properties, Defender XDR activity, affected resources, and trusted channel user testimony. Step 3. Record the evidence-backed confirmed compromise disposition in Microsoft Entra ID protection. Step 4. Replace the password and authentication method state, validate account control, and restore permitted sign-in. Credible active token misuse makes denial of new authentication and session refresh token revocation the safety prerequisite for extended investigation. Correlated evidence and trusted channel testimony establish the disposition recorded in ID protection. Credential and authentication method replacement then restores account ownership before sign-in is restored. None of the items announces its position. Exam clue. Distinguish the state changed by each action: token issuance, session reuse, evidence confidence, ID protection disposition, and authentication ownership. The dependency chain is not the wording chronology. Question 31 of 45. Select one answer. Under the Tailspin Zero Trust Access Investigation case, Microsoft Entra Connect Sync continues to complete imports, synchronization cycles, and exports in the Tailspin tenant. The registered Connect Health Agent services are running, but the portal has received no new sync health data from one active server since an outbound TLS inspection policy was enabled. A connectivity test from that server fails during the TLS handshake to the Connect Health service endpoints. What should the lead identity architect do? Option A. In Connect Health settings, enable the agent to upload all error logs while leaving the outbound inspection path unchanged. Option B. Convert the Tailspin domain from cloud authentication to federation, so health data is sent through the federation servers. Option C. Run the Microsoft Entra Connect wizard and remove the active sync server from the topology, then rely on the other tenant servers. Option D. Exclude the Connect Health service endpoints from TLS inspection, allow the required outbound TCP 443 connectivity, and rerun the agent connectivity test. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Exclude the Connect Health service endpoints from TLS inspection. Allow the required outbound TCP 443 connectivity and rerun the agent connectivity test. Connect Health data upload is an outbound agent function that can fail independently of Microsoft Entra Connect synchronization. Microsoft documents that the agent requires outbound TCP 443 access to its service endpoints, and that TLS inspection or termination can break registration or data upload. The healthy sync cycles, running agent services, stale timestamp, and TLS test failure isolate the monitoring transport, so bypassing inspection for the required endpoints and verifying connectivity is the least disruptive remediation. Exam clue. When synchronization succeeds but Connect Health goes stale, split the sync engine from the monitoring plane. Use the agent service state and endpoint connectivity evidence before changing synchronization or authentication architecture. Question 32 of 45. Arrange all actions from first to last. Under the Tailspin Zero Trust Access investigation case, Tailspin must provide Finance Pilot users access to ledger.corp.tailspin.com over TCP 443 by using Microsoft Entra private access. The global secure access client is already deployed, but the private access traffic forwarding profile is disabled. No private network connector group or global secure access enterprise application exists for the resource. Finance Pilot is a non-nesty group, and access must require a compliant device through conditional access. Arrange the actions in the required deployment order. Items in the displayed order. Item A. Create a conditional access policy that targets the global secure access enterprise application and requires a compliant device for Finance Pilot. Item B. Directly assign the non-nesty Finance Pilot group to the Global Secure Access Enterprise application. Item C. Deploy a private network connector that can reach ledger.corp.tailspin.com and place it in an active connector group. Item D. Create the Global Secure Access Enterprise application, select the active connector group, and add the ledger.corp.corp:443 application segment. Item E. Enable the private access traffic forwarding profile for the tenant and its intended pilot assignment. Lock in your answer. The correct order is Step 1. Deploy a private network connector that can reach ledger.corp.tailspin.com and place it in an active connector group. Step 2. Create the Global Secure Access Enterprise application. Select the active connector group and add the ledger.corp.tailspin.com 443 application segment. Step 3. Directly assign the non-nested Finance Pilot group to the Global Secure Access Enterprise application. Step 4. Create a conditional access policy that targets the Global Secure Access Enterprise application and requires a compliant device for Finance Pilot. Step 5. Enable the private access traffic forwarding profile for the tenant and its intended pilot assignment. Microsoft documents the per-app process in this order. Establish an active connector group, create the Global Secure Access app, assign users or groups, configure conditional access, and enable private access. Each stage creates the object needed by the next control plane. Enabling the disabled traffic profile last ensures production forwarding begins only after the application path, authorization, and compliant device requirement are ready. Exam clue. For a greenfield private access rollout, trace dependencies from network reachability to application definition, entitlement, policy, and finally, traffic acquisition. The client alone does not publish or authorize a private resource. Question 33 of 45. Select 2 answers. Under the Tailspin Zero Trust Access investigation case, the lead identity architect is validating an OAuth governance rollout. The security team tracks a catalog watch entry for an app with rare community use and high severity permissions, but no Tailspin user has authorized it. The connected app inventory also contains apps with the same risk profile and tenant authorizers. Separately, the governance board records that one connected integration may remain in service after review. Which 2 actions belong in the rollout runbook? Option A. Leave the retained integration undetermined and place it in an inventory query filtered by common community use, using query membership as the record that its review is complete. Option B. Create the OAuth policy with rare community use and high permission filters for the tenant authorized inventory. Keep the zero authorizer watch entry outside claimed alert coverage until tenant authorization occurs. Option C. Mark the accepted app as approved to distinguish it from unreviewed apps, without treating approval as a change to existing user access. Option D. Create the same rare high-permission OAuth policy and include the zero authorizer watch entry using its community use value to generate alerts before any tenant user authorizes it. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are C. Mark the accepted app as approved to distinguish it from unreviewed apps, without treating approval as a change to existing user access. And B, create the OAuth policy with rare community use and high permission filters for the tenant authorized inventory. Keep the zero authorizer watch entry outside claimed alert coverage until tenant authorization occurs. OAuth app policies can filter on permissions and community use, but they trigger alerts only for apps authorized by users in the tenant. Therefore, A accurately bounds the policy, while C overclaims pre-authorization coverage. An administrator can mark an app approved, banned, or undetermined. Approval distinguishes a reviewed app and has no end-user effect, so B fits the retained integration. Community use reports popularity and inventory queries only narrow displayed results, so D cannot substitute query membership for approved state. Exam clue. Evaluate policy eligibility separately from search criteria, then distinguish popularity evidence from reviewed state. Community use can refine both policy and inventory searches, but it neither removes the tenant authorization prerequisite nor records an administrator's review decision. Question 34 of 45. Match each trace to one corrective change. Each change is used once. Under the tailspin investigation, each audit trace contains exactly one defective privileged access layer. Match each trace to the smallest corrective change. Treat facts not identified as defective in that trace as controls that must remain unchanged. Requirements. Requirement 1. Trace 2. Before a request, a storage ops member has no data production access. After a request, access is limited to rg-data-prod. The request nevertheless completes for 8 hours, with neither an operator check nor a new sign-in challenge, although the contributor policy at subscription scope has the intended controls. The recovery drill succeeds, while role requests are unavailable. Requirement 2. Trace 1. The PIM assignment inventory shows exactly one contributor schedule for storage ops, an active assignment at subscription scope. No direct or group-derived contributor assignment exists at either resource group. Before any request, a member can change resources in rg-data-prod and another resource group. The rg-data-prod activation audit already shows the required operator check, sign-in challenge, and 1-hour limit. A drill also confirms that a cloud-only recovery identity retains tenant administration when role requests are unavailable. Requirement 3. Trace 3. Storage ops has no access before requesting it and receives only rg-data-prod access afterward. The request audit shows an operator check, a new sign-in challenge, and a 1-hour limit at that resource. During a drill that disables role requests, each cloud-only recovery identity can sign in but has no tenant administration authorization. Its directory role schedule is eligible. Target bank. Choice A. For storage ops, retire the listed Azure resource assignment and provision contributor so privilege requires a request and applies only to rg-data-prod. Leave that resource's activation policy and the recovery identities unchanged. Choice B. Keep the Azure resource schedule and its activation policy, but make the cloud-only recovery identities global administrator assignments permanently active and continue monitoring them. Choice C. Keep the existing eligible schedule, but configure the contributor activation policy on the rg-data-prod role resource object. Do not alter the recovery identities. Lock in your answer. The correct mapping is requirement 1 maps to C. Keep the existing eligible schedule, but configure the contributor activation policy on the rg-data-prod role/resource object. Do not alter the recovery identities. Requirement 2 maps to A. For storage ops, retire the listed Azure resource assignment and provision contributor so privilege requires a request and applies only to rg-data prod. Leave that resource's activation policy and the recovery identities unchanged. Requirement 3 maps to B. Keep the Azure resource schedule and its activation policy, but make the cloud-only recovery identities global administrator assignments permanently active and continue monitoring them. Each trace deliberately includes passing evidence for 2 layers and failure evidence for 1. Trace 1's assignment inventory identifies a single active subscription scope schedule and excludes direct or group-derived alternatives, so standing cross-resource authorization is entailed by assignment state and scope. Trace 2 isolates the non-inherited exact role resource settings because assignment timing and scope are correct, but activation controls differ from the subscription policy. Trace 3 isolates the directory recovery assignment because normal Azure PIM behavior is correct, while an eligible emergency role supplies no authorization when requests are unavailable. Exam clue. For every trace, classify all 3 layers before matching: the inventoried principal assignment state and scope, the exact role resource settings object, and whether directory recovery remains authorized without role activation. Verify that a proposed change fixes the defective owner while preserving both passing layers. Question 35 of 45. Select one answer. Contoso publishes a multi-tenant reconciliation API. A daemon owned by Fabricam uses a valid X509 certificate, runs without a signed-in user, and must only submit finalized merger reconciliation batches to Contoso. The API authorizes callers from the roles claim. Existing API roles allow broader read and write operations, and Contoso administrators must retain approval of tenant access. Which design provides the required access with least privilege? Option A. On the API registration, expose a reconciliation.subrole assignable to applications. Add that application permission to the Fabricam client, then have a Contoso administrator grant consent in Contoso. Option B. Grant the existing broad read-write application role to the Fabricam client and replace its valid certificate before requesting a new token. Option C. On the API registration, expose a delegated reconciliation.save scope. Add that delegated permission to the Fabricam client, then let the daemon consent when it requests a token. Option D. Enable user assignment required on the API enterprise application and assign Fabricam's daemon operators to it without configuring an API application permission. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. On the API registration, expose a reconciliation. Submitting app role assignable to applications, add that application permission to the Fabricam client. Then have a Contoso administrator grant consent in Contoso. A daemon uses the client credentials flow and therefore needs an application permission rather than a delegated scope. For a custom API, an application permission is an app role exposed by the API and made assignable to applications. Defining a narrow reconciliation select role supplies least privilege. Adding it to the Fabricam client establishes the requested permission, and Contoso administrator consent authorizes that client in the tenant whose API data it will access. The existing certificate handles client authentication and does not need to change. Exam clue. Separate workload authentication from API authorization. For a userless caller, define a least privileged app role on the API. Configure it as an application permission on the client, and obtain administrator consent in the tenant where access is granted. Question 36 of 45. Select one answer. Contoso protects the permission to hard delete applications from the recycle bin by assigning authentication context C7 to the supported permission. The C7 conditional access policy includes the merger operations administrators and requires phishing-resistant MFA. During testing in the Microsoft Entra Admin Center, an included administrator is repeatedly asked to re-authenticate and can never satisfy the protected action. Sign-in logs show that C7 was requested and that the administrator completed the required method. The C7 policy state is report only. What should the identity architect do? Option A, remove C7 from the hard delete permission so the administrator can perform the action without the authentication context. Option B, replace the C7 authentication context policy with a conditional access policy that targets high user risk and requires risk remediation. Option C, set the conditional access policy associated with C7 to on and retest the protected action. Option D, grant the administrator the global administrator role in addition to the existing role that authorizes the hard delete operation. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Set the conditional access policy associated with C7 to on and retest the protected action. Protected actions enforce the conditional access policy associated with the authentication context assigned to the permission. The evidence confirms that C7 is bound, requested, and assigned to the user, and that the administrator can perform the required authentication. Microsoft documents a repeated reauthorization loop when the associated policy does not exist or is off or report only. Setting the C7 policy to on repairs the enforcement lifecycle while preserving the authorization and protected action binding. Exam clue. For protected action prompt loop, verify the permission's context binding, the requested context in sign-in evidence, user targeting, method satisfaction, and finally policy state. Report only observes evaluation, but cannot satisfy the protected action. Question 37 of 45. Select two answers. Contoso is onboarding member accounts for users from a newly integrated partner. The users will encounter medium or high sign-in risk when accessing Contoso resources, and legitimate users should recover access without help desk intervention. The identity architect is designing the risk policy and authentication readiness controls. Which two actions should be included? Option A, stage authentication method registration from trusted sessions for each user before that user enters the enforced sign-in risk population. Option B, use an authentication method registration campaign during medium and high-risk events as the grant control that remediates those sign-ins. Option C, create a conditional access policy for medium and high sign-in risk that requires the built-in multi-factor authentication strength. Option D, use a high user risk policy requiring secure password change as the control that clears medium and high sign-in risk events. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A, stage authentication method registration from trusted sessions for each user before that user enters the enforced sign-in risk population, and C, create a conditional access policy for medium and high sign-in risk that requires the built-in multi-factor authentication strength. The enforced medium-high sign-in risk policy must require the built-in multi-factor authentication strength. A legitimate user can satisfy that grant and remediate the risky sign-in only with an already registered usable method. So trusted session registration must be staged before enforcement reaches that user. User risk password remediation and a registration campaign are adjacent controls, but neither substitutes for the sign-in risk condition and grant. Exam clue. Separate three nearby control owners. Sign-in risk conditional access evaluates the event. User risk password change remediates a user state, and registration campaigns prepare methods but are not a risky sign-in grant. Question 38 of 45. Select one answer. Contoso successfully piloted password hash synchronization, PHS, by using staged rollout for a federated domain. Password hashes are current, and pilot sign-ins succeeded without ADFS. During an approved cutover, an administrator recently changed contoso.com to managed. Fresh browser tests now show mixed routing between Microsoft Entra sign-in and the former federation path. ADFS is healthy, the maintenance window remains open, and no outage has been declared. What should the lead identity architect do next? Option A. Deploy pass-through authentication agents and change the target method to PTA while the domain conversion is being evaluated, so credential validation remains dependent on on-premises Active Directory. Option B. Use getMGDomain to verify the authoritative authentication type, keep the maintenance window open for the documented conversion interval, and retest fresh browser sign-ins before choosing rollback or dependency removal. Option C. When getMGDomain first reports managed, disable staged rollout and retire the federation service immediately, using that directory state as the complete cutover acceptance test. Option D. Restore the documented federation configuration as soon as any fresh browser test reaches ADFS, treating residual federation routing as proof that the managed conversion failed. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Use getMGDomain to verify the authoritative authentication type, keep the maintenance window open for the documented conversion interval, and retest fresh browser sign-ins before choosing rollback or dependency removal. Microsoft documents a bounded interval for federated to managed conversion and directs administrators to verify authentication type with getMGDomain and test fresh Microsoft Entra sign-ins. Mixed routing during a recent conversion does not independently prove PHS failure. PHS has already passed staged validation, so changing methods targets the wrong layer. Likewise, rollback or federation retirement should follow authoritative state plus end-to-end validation, not a single route observation or the first managed result. Exam clue. Treat domain state, propagation, and end-to-end sign-in evidence as separate gates. Do not infer failure from one transitional route or retire dependencies from directory state alone. Question 39 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam must restore 120 recently deleted cloud user accounts. A user administrator uploads a CSV copied from an earlier bulk create job. The file contains user principal names, omits the version row, and uses the heading username parenthesis user principal name. Bulk restore rejects the file during validation. What should the administrator do? Option A. Rename the existing UPN heading to Object ID, required, while leaving the UPN values and omitted version row unchanged. Option B. Reuse the bulk create template and add initial passwords and block sign-in values for the deleted users before resubmitting it. Option C. Use bulk import members on a security group and rely on group membership import to restore any deleted user objects referenced by UPN. Option D. From deleted users, start bulk restore. Download the current operation-specific template, preserve its version and header rows, replace the example row with each deleted user's object ID, and resubmit the validated file. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. From deleted users, start bulk restore, download the current operation-specific template, preserve its version and header rows, replace the example row with each deleted user's object ID, and resubmit the validated file. Bulk restore has its own CSV contract. Microsoft Learn requires the downloaded template structure to remain unchanged and identifies object ID as the only required user value. The administrator must replace example data with the deleted object's IDs, validate, and submit the job. Row failures can then be inspected in bulk operation results. A create template, a renamed UPN column, or group import operates at the wrong lifecycle or object boundary. Exam clue. For any bulk job, bind the file to the operation first, preserve that operation's current template, and provide the required immutable identifier rather than relabeling data from another lifecycle action. Question 40 of 45. Select 2 answers. Fabricam uses a custom OpenID Connect web application to manage application credentials across several integrated tenants. Members of privileged app operators need ordinary read access without step-up prompts. The rotate production secret action requires a phishing-resistant authentication strength and a compliant device. The web app and API can be modified. 2 monitored emergency accounts must remain available, and policy impact must be evaluated before enforcement. Which 2 design actions should the lead identity architect include? Option A. Publish an authentication context for privileged credential changes. Target it with a report-only conditional access policy for privileged app operators that excludes the emergency accounts and requires both the phishing-resistant authentication strength and a compliant device. Option B. Map both ordinary credential metadata reads and rotate production secret to the published context. Have the API verify the ACRS claim and use the same claims challenge flow for either operation. Option C. Publish an authentication context for privileged credential changes. Target it with a report-only conditional access policy for privileged app operators that excludes the emergency accounts and requires the phishing-resistant authentication strength. Option D. Map rotate production secret to the published context. Have the API verify the ACRS claim and return a claims challenge when it is absent, and have the client resubmit that challenge to Microsoft Entra ID. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are D. Map rotate production secret to the published context. Have the API verify the ACRS claim and return a claims challenge when it is absent, and have the client resubmit that challenge to Microsoft Entra ID. And A. Publish an authentication context for privileged credential changes. Target it with a report-only conditional access policy for privileged app operators that excludes the emergency accounts and requires both the phishing-resistant authentication strength and a compliant device. Authentication context provides granular protection only when both control planes are complete. The tenant publishes the context and targets it with a conditional access policy containing the required authentication strength and compliant device grants, emergency exclusions, and report-only evaluation. The application maps only the sensitive rotation action, the API checks ACRS, and the client handles a claims challenge. Omitting device compliance leaves the policy incomplete. Mapping ordinary reads makes the otherwise valid application flow overbroad. Exam clue. Evaluate the policy half and application half independently. The policy must contain every required grant and exclusion, while the app must request and verify the context only at the protected action. Question 41 of 45. Match each observation to one identity object. Each identity object is used once. Fabricam runs a multi-tenant application on Azure App Service. It must retire the application certificate without changing the application's client ID or the permissions already consented in customer tenants. The design uses the app service identity as a federated credential for the application. Match each rollout observation to the identity object that owns the described role. Requirements. Requirement 1. The app service calls its platform token endpoint and obtains a token whose subject is the object ID of the principal attached to that host. This token is used only as the client assertion for the next exchange. Requirement 2. A home tenant record stores the issuer, subject, and audience API : Azure AD token exchange. The workload continues to request the downstream token by using the unchanged application client ID. Requirement 3. After customer tenant admin consent, this tenant local object retains the application's granted permissions, while the Azure hosting resource is replaced. Target bank. Choice A. The home tenant application registration configured with the federated identity credential. Choice B. The application's service principal in the resource tenant. Choice C. The user-assigned managed identity attached to the Azure hosting resource. Lock in your answer. The correct mapping is Requirement 1 maps to C, the user-assigned managed identity attached to the Azure hosting resource. Requirement 2 maps to A, the home tenant application registration configured with the federated identity credential. Requirement 3 maps to B, the application's service principal in the resource tenant. The architecture is a directed identity chain, not 3 alternative managed identity deployments. Azure Compute first obtains a token as its attached managed identity. The application object's federated identity credential trusts that token's issuer, managed identity principal, ID subject, and token exchange audience, allowing exchange for a token addressed to the existing application client ID. In each customer resource tenant, the application's service principal remains the local security principal that carries consented permissions. No row assigns one shared user-assigned identity directly to multiple resources, and no external OIDC subject federates into a user-assigned managed identity. Exam clue. Trace ownership along the token path. Who produces the source assertion? Where the trust tuple is configured, and which tenant local principal carries authorization. Question 42 of 45. Arrange all actions from first to last. Under the Fabricam Privileged Application Lifecycle case, Fabricam is introducing PIM for the Cloud Application Administrator role for a merger cutover. The control baseline includes 2 tested cloud-only emergency accounts with permanent active global administrator assignments and independent authentication. Routine activation must require a justification, approval by one of 2 designated approvers, and a duration no longer than 2 hours. May is the first eligible assignee. Omar is a designated approver and is not May. Arrange the runbook actions into the dependency-safe order for a resilient and auditable first activation. Items in the displayed order. Item A. Record successful access tests for both cloud-only emergency accounts. Confirm their permanent active global administrator assignments and independent authentication, and verify alerting without using them for routine approval. Item B. Set the Cloud Application Administrator activation controls to require justification and approval, designate the 2 approvers, and cap activation duration at 2 hours. Item C. Inspect May's assignment state and the Microsoft Entra roles resource audit for the activation and Omar's approval decision. Item D. Omar reviews May's activation request, records a business justification, and submits his decision in PIM approve requests. Item E. May selects Activate for her eligible role, supplies the required reason and a duration within the limit, and completes the required verification. Item F. Create May's eligible assignment for the Cloud Application Administrator role. Lock in your answer. The correct order is Step 1. Record successful access tests for both cloud-only emergency accounts. Confirm their permanent active global administrator assignments and independent authentication. And verify alerting without using them for routine approval. Step 2. Set the Cloud Application Administrator activation controls to require justification and approval. Designate the 2 approvers and cap activation duration at 2 hours. Step 3. Create May's eligible assignment for the Cloud Application Administrator role. Step 4. May selects Activate for her eligible role, supplies the required reason and a duration within the limit, and completes the required verification. Step 5. Omar reviews May's activation request, records a business justification, and submits his decision in PIM Approve Requests. Step 6. Inspect May's assignment state and the Microsoft Entra role's resource audit for the activation and Omar's approval decision. The emergency baseline is deliberately independent of routine PIM and is validated as the resilience prerequisite. Role settings create the justification, approval, approver, and duration rules that govern an eligible assignment. Eligibility gives May an activatable role but no active privilege. Her activation creates the request Omar can decide, and the active state plus resource audit can be verified only once those workflow records exist. Exam clue. Translate each action into the state it creates and the state it consumes. Order the state transitions without relying on words such as before, after, pending, or approved window. Question 43 of 45. Arrange all actions from first to last. Fabricam must stream Microsoft Entra audit logs and service principal sign-in logs from its privileged application tenant to a corporate SIEM through Azure Event Hubs. The integration currently has none of the required destination, tenant route, or consumer state. Arrange the 4 implementation actions into a dependency valid order. Items in the displayed order. Item A. Set Event Hubs as the diagnostic destination. Select the associated subscription and namespace and save the setting. Item B. Create an Event Hubs namespace and Event Hub in an Azure subscription associated with the Microsoft Entra tenant. Item C. Create a named Microsoft Entra diagnostic setting containing audit logs and the required service principal sign-in log categories. Item D. Configure the corporate SIEM connector for the Event Hub and confirm that newly generated Microsoft Entra records are received. Lock in your answer. The correct order is Step 1. Create an Event Hubs namespace and Event Hub in an Azure subscription associated with the Microsoft Entra tenant. Step 2. Create a named Microsoft Entra diagnostic setting containing audit logs and the required service principal sign-in log categories. Step 3. Set Event Hubs as the diagnostic destination. Select the associated subscription and namespace and save the setting. Step 4. Configure the corporate SIEM connector for the Event Hub and confirm that newly generated Microsoft Entra records are received. Microsoft Entra diagnostic settings can select only an existing Event Hubs destination. The diagnostic setting then defines the required log categories and is saved with the Event Hub subscription and namespace route. The SIEM consumer can validate an operational stream only after the source-side route exists. The learner-facing action list is shuffled and contains no rationale or explicit predecessor-successor wording. Exam clue. Model the runbook as state dependencies, destination existence, source category definition, persisted route binding, and downstream consumption. Question 44 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam extends Microsoft Entra password protection to an acquired ADDS forest. The forest is associated with Fabricam's tenant. The proxy service is running with outbound service connectivity, and DC agents are installed throughout the forest. After directory replication, every DC agent admin log repeatedly records event 30017, and no downloaded password policy is available. Which action should the identity architect take first? Option A. Run register Azure AD password protection proxy for the proxy using credentials from Fabricam's Microsoft Entra tenant, then allow directory discovery to converge. Option B. Validate TCP 135 and the proxy RPC server port from each domain. Repair any blocked RPC path and restart DC agent discovery. Option C. Register the proxy using the acquired company's legacy Microsoft Entra tenant, because the proxy serves that company's ADDS forest, then wait for replication. Option D. Run register Azure AD password protection forest again against Fabricam's tenant, and force ADDS replication before checking the DC agent logs. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Run register Azure AD password protection proxy. For the proxy, using credentials from Fabricam's Microsoft Entra tenant. Then allow directory discovery to converge. Microsoft documents event 30017 when a DC agent cannot locate a registered proxy, most commonly because the proxy was not registered. A running service does not establish directory registration. Event 30016 instead identifies forest registration, while event 30018 identifies communication with a proxy after discovery. Proxy and forest registrations must use the same tenant, so the proxy should be registered with Fabricam tenant credentials. Exam clue. Use the event boundary to identify both object and phase. Forest registration, proxy registration discovery, and registered proxy RPC communication produce different evidence. Question 45 of 45. Select one answer. Fabricam uses pass-through authentication, PTA, for a managed domain. 3 authentication agents on separate Tier 0 servers were healthy, and password hash synchronization is also enabled. Following an outbound proxy policy rollout, users cannot sign in, and all 3 agents report inactive. Agent and proxy traces contain intermittent proxy authentication and certificate trust failures, while domain controllers and Microsoft Entra Connect synchronization remain healthy. Fabricam must retain PTA. What should the lead identity architect do first? Option A. Allow the documented PTA service endpoints through the shared proxy, deploy the corporate inspection route to the agent hosts, and use successful browser requests from each server as the connectivity acceptance test. Option B. Configure the authentication agent service context to use the supported outbound proxy path. Allow the documented PTA service endpoints, bypass inline TLS inspection for that traffic, and verify that the agents become active before retesting sign-ins. Option C. Apply the documented endpoint allow list and proxy credentials to the signed-in administrators per user proxy profiles. Then recycle the authentication agent services and retest. Option D. Move one agent to a separate proxy pool and public egress address. Clone the current corporate proxy baseline for consistent controls and use that agent as the availability path. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Configure the authentication agent service context to use the supported outbound proxy path. Allow the documented PTA service endpoints, bypass inline TLS inspection for that traffic, and verify that the agents become active before retesting sign-ins. PTA authentication agents establish outbound service connections to documented endpoints and can remain inactive when the service context cannot authenticate through the proxy. Microsoft also advises avoiding inline TLS inspection or termination for this traffic. The evidence is consistent with a shared service context proxy fault, while healthy directory synchronization tests a different path. Per user proxy settings, generic browser reachability, or moving an agent under the same central policy do not repair the agent service channel. PHS coexistence is not automatic PTA failover. Exam clue. Test the identity and trust context actually used by the authentication agent service. Browser reachability, a different egress IP, or generic Entra access does not prove the PTA channel. You completed all 45 questions. Group any misses by objective, identify the requirement you overlooked, and answer again from the mechanism rather than from a memorized keyword. Thanks for practicing with WebLizard CertLab. Review your week objectives, revisit the complete exam clues, and continue with the next SC-300 practice exam when you are ready.